I think we have to be serious about how brutally competitive the world is. And I think the idea that we should just hope that if we just have fair competition, everything will work out is unrealistic. I think we do need government at the federal or provincial level making some big bets.
Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sara Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's climate and energy challenges. On January 27th, we were back at the Energy Transition Center in Calgary to record another show before a live audience. This time, we took on one of the toughest questions in Canadian climate politics: what energy transition actually looks like for Alberta. We dug into emissions, economics, diversification, and the uncomfortable trade-offs that tend to get glossed over in public debate. Thanks as always to Avatar Innovations for being such gracious hosts. We all had a lot of fun with the conversation, and I hope you do too. Just a note, unfortunately we had some mic issues, so apologies for any audio hiccups you might notice. Now here's the show. Thanks so much, Kevin, and thanks to your whole crew for hosting us again. As you'd mentioned, this is the third consecutive show that we've done. Can't say annual because of our complete disorganization, given Sara's absence last year. We weren't back last year, but we're committed to making it an annual. And it's
You
great.
were just worried you wouldn't get enough people since I wasn't there.
Sara, we're nothing without you. Without you, this band doesn't run. We're gone.
Well, I do notice that David and I are wearing name tags and Sara not, because Sara obviously assumes that people will just know who she is.
I need a little ego boost because my kids are doing like an energy unit in school right now, and they were sitting in the other room like studying for their test, and they absolutely refused to let me tell them anything about energy.
We got a combination of sort of fandom, but also I got an ego crush on Sunday because Ed and I were on a backcountry skiing, and we were doing the up track with some other Albertans who we were chatting with and their dog, chatting with the dog too, had these cool boots. But anyway, then one of them turned around and said, like, I recognize your voice from Energy versus Climate. But he recognized Ed's voice. He had no clue who I was.
He practically went up to David and said, "And you are?" I said an appendage. Well, thank you, David.
That's right. We had another guy with us, my friend Jeff, but we said that Jeff was really you in disguise.
Yeah. Well, it's great to be back, and we love being here and the partnership. And I will note we did a show on offsets a couple years ago, 2-3 years ago, and it is our most popular show ever. So these live shows can resonate. And just to let you know that, I'm putting you all on notice because we would like you to participate. We're going to get there. Hopefully we won't just be three monotonal talking heads for too long. We're going to save a bunch of time at the end for audience questions. And just so you have the extra heads up, you can see a stand. You're welcome to line up and in front of. We also will have Michael. Michael, raise your hand, Michael. There, he's going to have a mic and he'll be roving around. The goal for tonight, we kind of said, well, what should we talk about? And, it's kind of Alberta's energy transition. And what we want to do is unpack Alberta's role within these very shifting energy markets, Alberta energy transition. And as we're always trying to do, we want to try to steer away from the happy talk and get to the hard truths, get to have a more honest conversation than what we think we've been having to date. And to do that, we're all going to open just with a few thoughts on topics related to Alberta's energy transition. I'll go first, and then David, and then Sara, and then we're going to open it up to a three-way conversation between us. And looking at my watch, by about 1:45 or 10:10, then we'll turn to your questions. So, don't hesitate to start thinking of them now. For me, and just to put my cards on the table around an honest conversation, I want to acknowledge perhaps what is abundantly obvious. I'm going to start with Alberta and Canada, and David's going to go macro and talk about the world and global oil markets. To state the obvious, Alberta's and Canada's economies are heavily dependent on oil and gas right now. And in fact, and this is something I picked up from you, David, when we were chatting, Alberta is nearly in the 1 barrel per day per person club, which is pretty rare amongst advanced industrialized countries. We're not a country, but we're a jurisdiction.
But we might be a country.
Should we cover that topic too? Should we? Yeah.
Too soon.
Yeah, too soon. And as part of that, you have to recognize that they're roughly, and it depends on your yardstick or your measuring stick, but the 300,000 workers who are in the oil and gas economy or adjacent to the oil and gas economy, let's face it, they earn good money. They earn often more than the workers in other industries. So that's one hard truth that I think we need to sort of look at when we're talking about Alberta's energy transition. And in effect, you could call, and many have, Alberta a petro state, given its dependence on the oil and gas economy. The second hard truth is the oil sands is a very good cash flow business. And I'm going to specify the oil sands. And it's of course, subject to the price of oil in the world, but generally it kicks off a lot of good cash flow. We as Albertans, we're very accustomed to the public revenue that it generates. And frankly, as Albertans, we appreciate the good schools, the good hospitals that we have, in contrast to a bunch of other provinces in the country. You can tell when you drive out of Alberta and get into other provinces when you see just the difference in the road quality. So I think those of us as Albertans, when we talk about energy transition, we often say that Canada and Alberta will be leaders in the energy transition. And the analogy I use is, if the world were transitioning away from wine, would you expect the French to be leading that transition? Kevin, I know, doesn't like that analogy. We've debated that one. Rather, you would look at it and say they should be kicking and screaming that way. But we have this happy talk of saying that we like to be leaders. And if you look at the actions of the Carney government, especially in the last few months, you could argue that they're doing the exact opposite, that they are actually emphasizing or even doubling down on Canada's dependence on the oil and gas economy. So that's my opener, my cards on the table around what I think in terms of Alberta and energy transition and its place within Canada and the world. David, you want to talk to us about some ideas you have and some forecasting around the future of oil markets in particular and how that's going to affect our place.
Yeah, so I'm going to speak as a nerdy guy who doesn't really work in oil and gas, and my main job is in Chicago. I'm going to tell a bunch of Albertans about the oil market. And yeah, I basically just asked my AI to summarize, and I'll repeat what it says. But I think I'm going to give you the punchline. I think is that lots of the political talk here is that if the federal government wasn't holding us back, if Alberta really wasn't an independent country, if Danielle Smith was prime minister, we'd have this break boom and we'd be able to export a lot more. And I think this is just nonsense. And I want to say a little bit about why I think it's nonsense. So let's kind of go to the basics of where oil is going and what might happen over the next, say, half decade or decade. So just to kind of remind you, to break it down, The global oil demand is roughly a little over 60% for transportation. That's including road transportation and aviation and shipping. Those two are about equal now, both at about 7 or 8% of total. Then beyond that, there's petrochemicals about 15% and 20% for a bunch of other little stuff. Petrochemicals is growing. We can talk about transportation. Obviously, aviation is going to grow and keep growing, and I don't think aviation is going to get off fossil fuels for a really long time. But the biggest chunk of that, road vehicles, I think will. Last year, 2025, global sales of EVs and hybrids were about just over 25% of global sales. Reasonable projections put that at kind of in the mid 30s in just a couple years. Obviously, it takes a while for things to move through the vehicle fleet, but you don't have to be a genius to do the math and figure out that by like 2030, this is going to be taking a real bite out of global oil. And I think it's not going to stop. And I think it's easy to think about the fact that we have this hideous blowhard in charge of the country, or the crack house down south, who's saying a bunch of things that imagines it's going to change it. But I think the fundamentals of electricity getting cheaper in lots of ways, we can talk about markets that it's not, of batteries getting cheaper, of these vehicles getting cheaper, I don't think it's going to stop. I think it's just an argument about exactly how quickly it goes. So that's how I think about it. And I think looking at standard forecasts, people expect oil demand to be pretty flat from here, peaking late this decade, with global typical price forecasts kind of in the $50 a barrel WTI or a little above world. And so my understanding, again, this is what my AI tells me, somebody may tell me I'm totally wrong, the operating costs of Alberta oil sands are of order 20 to 30, depending on which business it is. So those guys can keep making money for Alberta with their existing assets for a long, long time. It's going to be a very long time before oil prices are below that. But the cost you need to build new investments is more like $70 or so. And people know much more than me on a WTI basis. And I just don't think there's any world where that happens in a sensible way. Plus, it's relatively high carbon oil. So it's both high capex oil and it's high carbon oil. I want to end with the fact there's lots of talk about the idea we're going to do CCS projects. I was the only academic, a bunch of other business people on this original federal panel and provincial panel that kind of recommended a bunch of this stuff for CCS in Canada. But I have never been convinced that putting a bunch of money into CCS in the oil sands makes any sense. From the point of view of an Albertan, it's not going to do three things. It's not going to fundamentally protect the oil and gas revenues that we need to keep Alberta going while we transition to something else. It's not going to transition to something else because it doesn't build any value add that we can sell to somebody else in a meaningful way. And I don't think it does much to emissions, because in the end, emissions in the oil sector are really driven fundamentally by changes in demand. There's plenty of supply. So I just don't get it, and I'd like to have a conversation about it.
So, David, I'm thinking of the durable chunks of the industries that are dependent on oil and gas. And you're right. I think aviation is one. I think petrochemicals is another. I think freight would be a third. But I also wonder about mobility in emerging markets. And I tend to think that two things happen. Climate activists tend to underweight the stickiness of oil and gas infrastructure in emerging economies, in the same way that I would say energy nerds tend to underweight how quickly economies can flip, or economics can flip with electrification. Both are assuming sort of single growth curves where it's a portfolio. But I want to go back to, I want you to convince me and people here that emerging economies will really choose electricity for their mobility instead of staying rooted in oil and gas.
Who knows? I want to hear what Sara has to say on this. But one obvious question is, how could the forecast I said be really wrong? I think one way it could be really wrong is that especially the places that have growing demand, like Africa, really get their political act together and do much better. So if Africa suddenly transforms and there's really rapid growth, that'll change the carbon trajectory and the oil and gas trajectory for sure. But I think it really has to be that. China looks like it's kind of peaked. India's going up, but North America and Europe are going down. This is all oil demand. It's really hard to see, unless Africa suddenly gets it together, that it's going to change. I was somebody who was the skeptic, as many of you listen to this podcast know, of how quickly either batteries or solar would go. But the answer is they are just going incredibly fast. I've been to India. I'm doing much stuff in the Indian government now, talking to people on the ground. There are contracts for solar plus 4 or 6 hours of battery storage that are closing at just a few cents a kilowatt hour. I just think this is, and the battery electric vehicles are flooding into relatively poor countries from China. So I think it's going to happen faster than the energy nerd said, not slower.
Yeah, I think I'm more on that side too, right? And I think to take a step back, I think there's a couple of things that are helpful to sort of acknowledge when we think about where this future might go. And one is that we have a lot of sort of truths, or almost let's call them beliefs, about energy that are really shortcuts in our thinking, right? Like the energy system has, to a large extent, behaved one way for the last 100 years, maybe even more than 100 years. Because of that, there are many things that we sort of know to be true that are not really fundamental truths, in the way that like the laws of physics are fundamental truths. And so I think that there is the potential for a lot of blind spots. And I think you also have a situation where there's a little bit of a like the boy who cried wolf, the energy nerds who cried energy transition or something, where there is a tendency to say, okay, we've been talking about this for a while. And I think that we continue to underestimate the way that the transition of a country's development, and sort of development meaning its increase of energy, can look very different when you have these very much lower cost, solar storage, electric vehicles, and so on. I'll give one example, or sort of one data point, and then I'll talk a little bit more about maybe the theory overall. But I just, there's a new report from Ember. They publish all kinds of really cool energy graphs. I don't know if like it's just energy nerds that look at them, but I feel like they should almost be front page news. So
You're kind of dreaming.
Yeah,
But
right. We can dream, right? But this graph is great. It looks at how the energy mix has transformed for countries as they, as time goes on, as their GDP increases, whatever it is. And so for the US, it traces out, and what Canada was on this graph, but I imagine it's very similar. It traces out this very clear curve from being essentially 100% bioenergy powered to, almost close to 100% fossil powered, and now it's starting to come back up and move towards having more electrons that are powering it. And what's really interesting is I think that experience that we have all lived, and the people that have taught us about energy, that are in the companies that we work with, have lived, and the people even before that, is like this is this fundamental truth that that's how energy use follows. And then you start to look at, now they add China to the graph, and whereas the US hit something like 90% in their, they call it fossil detour, China got to about a 70% fossil dependent system before it started to sort of turn around and move towards the electricity. And India now is starting to show, at least on this graph, a sign of turning around at about 55%. And so, you have these, like, in some sense, similar experiences of GDP growth, and then they had a whole bunch of other graphs that basically said the same thing, the amount of coal that's being used. But I think that these underlying technologies and the cost of those technologies being different when these other countries are going through this phase of economic growth means that there is a very real world where they take a different path. And that is not just sort of by chance, but there's actually, countries out there, as much as folks like Trump and others are trying to ensure that developing countries are using more oil and gas, there's others. where he said, among other things, was this quote of like, revolution is not a dinner party, but it's really insurrection or violence with one class overthrowing another. And so I found that quite interesting, because sometimes I'm pushing back on this idea of like, oh, well, the energy transition, here, that's just like an attack on the oil and gas sector, right? And people, the Trudeau wants to kill the oil and gas sector, and I don't think that's really true. But the leaders of other countries of the world definitely do want to, go after the oil and gas sector. And their tools are principally financial and others. But I think that to some extent, they really are succeeding in that goal. I think there's a big debate about exactly how fast that will go. But there is, as much as you want to sort of how we push back on this framing of the boogeyman, fighting the oil and gas sector, there's sort of a way to understand that as that's what is going on. It's just we don't get to like stop that in Canada necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, energy transition in the discussion, it'd be another hard truth we can talk about. It's extremely divisive. It's full of misinformation and disinformation. We did a show on that relative to EVs. And there doesn't seem to be any clear path to getting out of it, just in the way that there isn't a clear path to convincing a sizable chunk of the U.S. population that the 2020 election wasn't stolen, that those, unfortunately, views seem to be just set in concrete right now. And so to your point, I think I definitely can concede China, because now you've got more than 50% of new vehicles rolling off assembly lines are electrified. And as I learned, and by the way, here's a foreshadowing, we're going to have a show on China that features each of us interviewing different China experts and then mashing it all together, hopefully in a decent cut, and then responding to what we hear. But when I talked to Hong Li, who is a battery chemist with the China National Sciences Academy, he really looked at it and said, listen, the Chinese made this bet in the early 2000s, and in some ways they got lucky. So we credit them in saying, they're great soothsayers and Nostradamuses. In some ways, they got lucky with the bet, but they really went all in and they retooled the state. It will be more interesting to see what happens with India. And we'd had that show with Jayacindy to talk about it. And I think India can still go a couple ways. But one thing we know for the world, and if you're producing oil, is that India isn't going to absorb the slackened oil demand that's coming out of China, because its economy is based on different fundamentals. So to your earlier point, David, I really wonder what's going to happen in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, and I don't want to overstate. I mean, I think the world's still going to be using a lot of oil in 2040 and 2050.
I think that comment about, they got lucky is sort of an interesting one. And in some sense, you can take it even further and say that like that was the only reasonable bet to make for a large country that wasn't a petrostate, looking at how to, grow their energy use. So I think that to me, that comes back to like, you have the same kind of dynamics that we face here in Alberta, where you have the challenges of an incumbent industry that is able to, influence to a large degree and get a lot of government support and things, which is not unique at all to the particular incumbent industry we have. That's sort of a natural dynamic of an incumbency. And with China, you just had a different setup in terms of, what the incumbents were, who they could have been. So it's almost like it was a lucky bet, but maybe it was more just for them lucky that, it happened to be the thing that they had to back was the thing that, costs came down faster.
I want to pick up on one thing you asked about developing countries or commented on. I think precisely because of the dysfunction in lots of countries, like, say, take Pakistan, because the centralized electric power authority is doing a terrible job, that means that all these people are buying, local people are buying small solar and batteries. To be clear, that's not cost effective. If Pakistan was run really well, you do larger solar and you do more gas and so on. But in the actual way that it is run, which is pretty badly, that's what's happening. And that actually means the central grid is going to like lose customers. There's a big reshape coming. And that's true in a bunch of other countries. But the net effect is partly because solar and batteries are easy to site and they're easy to buy, even in countries that are relatively dysfunctional, you're just getting a lot of them. It's going very fast.
Excellent. Well, in China, tune in. You'll listen to Hong Li of the National Academy of Sciences and everyone else. It'll come out in a few weeks. So let's then bring it back to Alberta. And I want us to talk about credible paths to Alberta. Let's say it cares about climate. And let's say that, it's going to do its part for Canada to try to meet its international obligations in reducing emissions. It's hard to imagine the oil and gas industry meeting those climate targets and not doing something like curtailing production unless there's a moonshot. But I want you to talk about how can we bend emissions here without breaking the economic base? And perhaps you could talk about what should we do and what should we definitely not do? And maybe the starting point is, to what degree should we take public money? And if we say not all, some of Alberta's oil production and gas production is low carbon. Well, let's say there's a chunk that's high cost, high carbon. Should we be taking public money and spending it on trying to get these producers from the high cost, high carbon quadrant down to the low cost, low carbon quadrant? I feel like I'm leading the witnesses, and hopefully this will come up in questions, but I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, so I would say no, even though, I'm certainly a proponent of government investment in technologies, but there has to be the right reason that you're doing it for, right? So in particular, do you have some kind of future potential where costs will come down or some barrier to making these investments? And without that, it would happen otherwise. And I think I don't see that justification in the case of reducing emissions from the oil sands. As David said, there is cash coming out of this sector, right? So I think the extent to which there, should be money spent on reducing those emissions, a good chunk of that should come from, the revenue from that sector. Now, whether or not that's like actually politically feasible to do, I think I have a lot of doubts. I do think that when we think about, the decarbonization story in Alberta, in some ways it's sort of helpful to separate it out into the story of sort of what's happening with oil and gas and everything else. And so Alberta, I wrote down a couple numbers just to give us some context to discuss. So Canada's emissions from 2005 to 2022 overall went down 8% during that time. So you had more economic activity, but with lower carbon intensity. And a lot of that actually came from decarbonization of the electricity sector across Canada, so closure of the coal plants. I should say this is all coming from the Canadian Climate Institute's 440 megaton report. In Alberta, you had, so Canada 8% down overall. Alberta is actually 8% increase. And that was made up primarily of electricity again, emissions down by about 10%. It's probably more, this was to 2022, so that's probably a somewhat larger number actually if you look out to today because the grid is continuing to change. The oil and gas sector emissions up by 17%. So of course, a huge part of that is just more activity, some more energy intensive, also the SAGD, with some improvements in carbon intensity. And then interesting actually, industry, the rest of industry, agricultural, transportations, and buildings were basically all essentially flat. So I think there's something to break this into two parts that like it makes a lot of sense, I think, and it's part of our, I think, responsibility also to do things to reduce our emissions in those sectors, right? To continue to, which again is largely, not completely, but largely electrifying a lot of uses of energy. So whether that's transportation, whether that's buildings, doesn't mean it's going to 100% overnight, but moving towards that and producing electricity with lower emissions. I think those are things that we both have a moral responsibility to do. I think in many cases they also probably make sense, if you do them in the right way. Either they're cheaper or they can be more comfortable or there's all kinds of different reasons. And then there's the oil and gas elephant, literally, of the size in the room, where, you know, we can talk about what makes sense, and then what also is politically possible, because I think we have to face that too, right? As much as I would love to say, let's have a, you know, cap on oil and gas emissions, I hear that's not particularly popular.
I wonder why. Although, Sara, you and I kind of worked on it with the Alberta Climate Leadership Plan, and I thought it was a great tool. But sorry, just before you jump in, David, just because you talked about subsidies and just put public investment, put a fine point on it. Would you say there shouldn't be investment tax credits for decarbonization in the oil and gas industry? And if you're saying there shouldn't be investment tax credits, because that's avoided tax revenue, should there be investment tax credits for things like clean tech manufacturing and the renewable electricity industry?
So I think you could, I'll say a couple things. First, I don't think there should be, you know, 75% of the value tax credits, which is sort of what some people are talking about. You know, 72. Okay.
In Alberta, but only when it's stacked with a provincial tax credit.
You know, should there be 10% or something like that? You know, I think there's more room for discussion on both. I mean, interestingly, the electricity sector, a lot of the big development of wind and solar that we saw happening in Alberta happened before the renewable tax credits that the federal government came in and put in place. So, you know, I'm sure that my friends in the renewable sector would like to have those, and probably don't like what I think about that. But yeah, just, is that really needed? Or, you know, I think that if you're going to have some tax credits in the energy sector, then you should make sure that you're building a level playing field. And I guess my preference for that playing field is pretty low.
I obviously care about emissions. I've worked on climate my whole life, but I think Alberta's problem is to manage emissions in some way that's kind of reasonably responsible, which to me means focusing on reducing emissions in the normal Alberta economy, leaving kind of oil sands aside, which are a separate thing connected with the global oil business, and then finding a way to build a successful value-added businesses in Alberta that will make this economy work over decades ahead, where it's not going to be oil and gas. And to be clear, when I say not oil and gas, I think, say, 2 decades out, there's still going to be a bunch of oil and gas production, but it's going to be declining. And that means less skilled jobs, because it's just kind of like an OPEX play where you're grinding it out, and there's going to be people working hard, but employment, especially high value employment, will be going down. And in that world, Alberta really has to think about what it's going to do. And we have this huge skill set with both business skills and engineering skills and trade skills and lots of things that make this province great. I think the province needs to be somehow thinking, to the extent that it can collectively, about how to win at something else. It's not necessarily energy. I was interested to hear in the conversations before we started that Alberta Innovation has sort of officially added aerospace, and so did you, Calgary, and that might not be a bad bet. I think that uses a bunch of the skills, kinds of engineering skills potentially this place has. I think what worries me is the idea that we're going to put a bunch of that effort into trying to reduce the emissions intensity of oil sands in a way that just doesn't, in the end, build an Alberta future that we need. Because in the end, CCS and oil sands is a niche market, more or less niche to Alberta, unless Venezuela suddenly builds its oil sands, which doesn't seem likely. So it's not a big export case. And you know, if people can do it reasonably cheaply and reduces emissions cost effectively, great. I'm not against doing it. I just am against it being a central play.
I see Kevin Krausert, he's biting his tongue to the point where blood is streaming down his mouth. But that's okay, because as our host with the most, he's going to get the first question. And I'm just letting you know that in, I'd say, about 10 minutes, unless we continue to like the sounds of our own voices, we'll move to questions so we can get you involved. David, to your point, I wonder if we should be really focused on capturing as much wealth as possible from, and I said off the top that the oil sands is a high cash flow generating industry, not just the oil sands, but those industries, capture as much wealth as possible, and then to take that and sort of really bet on, you know, what are the next, on economic diversification. I know we should actually define economic diversification, but that can be in Alberta. We all talk about critical minerals. We talk about advanced plastics. We talk about healthcare. batteries, agri-food, agribusiness. There's a whole bunch of different things. And just to put my 2 cents worth in, I'd agree in terms of the workforce that we have. We have a highly skilled, highly trained workforce. And hopefully I'm not succumbing to happy talk. But and we've got communities that can take those workers and they can train them. We've got a provincial government that can train them. I know that we can do some rationalization between what U of C offers versus what U of A offers versus what U of L offers. We should do that in a more concerted way. But generally, we've got these tremendous assets.
Don't forget SAIT. I'm now the proud father of a kid who took machining at SAIT.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's right. Hey, that was really helpful. Everyone clap for SAIT. Here. I agree. The question remains, so I listed off a bunch of sectors. What do you bet on? Yeah. And this is a thing, and going back to the Emerson report of 2011, that in its time was the latest, greatest sort of treatise on economic diversification, had some good ideas, some of them it then landed with a thud with the Stelmach in the latter days of the Stelmach regime. It got shelved. There's some good information. And it seems every report after every report that proposes
So I'll propose a couple things there. I mean, to go back to one of the other questions you had is, yes, I think we are going to see a lot of wealth still coming from the oil and gas sector, and it does behoove us to use that in wise ways. And in fact, I think it's likely that we will see time periods where the oil price gets very high, right? And this whole concept of this transition that we're talking about is not orderly, like we line up and we reduce demand by this much and we reduce supply by this much and it matches out. In fact, we're likely to see much more volatility than we have in the past decades because we're getting used to a totally different dynamic of contracting demand. When you play that all the way out to the end, I've become really interested in my own research around what do we even start to do when we think about systems that start to get so small that they are no longer resilient? Eventually they get so small that they just can't function anymore. But at first they become sort of less resilient. And we actually don't have a lot of experience with this. One example would be like the phone system, the wired phone system, where you have places where government has basically stepped in. I'm more familiar with it in California. And there's sort of a mandate that you have a supplier of last resort, quote unquote, so that people are still able to get fixed line phone service if that's something that they want. And that may be discussions that we need to start having about, again, this is not at all tomorrow. We're talking about decades in the future, but something to start planning for. What I think can happen sooner is that volatility. But to answer the actual question you asked, I think to me, part of the answer is actually in the process, not the what you do. And I think an important part of that process actually is that you want to set up a system, a sort of research and innovation system that is relatively sheltered from political winds. And we have some good examples, right? I mean, I think the US, recent times notwithstanding, has some really great kind of ways that they have set up the research and development and innovation system that has allowed them to create, a lot of really impressive things. And there's some clear rules, and those involve things like, indeed, putting at arm's length from policymakers so that there isn't too much political environment, having a strong capacity within the state to make decisions about what to fund, to be willing to, fund a lot of different things and then start to whittle that down as they sort of compete. So there's sort of I won't go through the whole list. I think we once did a whole show about industrial, I'm forgetting the word. Yeah, industrial decarbonization and sort of what you do to support. So I think we don't have to reinvent the wheel there, but we have to be very careful in how we set up the system that is going to, invest that money wisely.
I'll start with the narrow thing on CCS. I think one way to say it is if I had dollars to invest in CCS, if I put them into cement plant CCS here, and it costs me a given X dollars to save 1 million tons a year, let's say it cost me the same X dollars to save 1 million tons a year in oil sands, which it may not, but let's say it did. I'd rather put it on the cement plant, because if you learn about that, that is an exportable thing. Roughly, I forget the number, 6% or so of global emissions are cement plants. A whole lot of them are going to have to decarbonize. If an Alberta company figures out a really good way to do that, that's a thing you can sell around the world. Whereas if you figure out a really good way to decarbonize an oil sands plant, there just aren't a lot of buyers. And I think that fundamental thing is something to think about. A related one for CCS, actually, to a shout out to some of the audience, is interesting ideas about combinations of biofuels and CCS. There's a bunch of these. There's several different Alberta companies pursuing these. Those are also things that can make low carbon fuels or hydrogen in different ways with carbon sequestration. Those are things that are also exportable. So I'd rather see that than oil sands. As to what outside energy sector Alberta should do to successfully diversify, I'm not the right person to ask. I think the obvious thing is, we're not living in the same rules-based international order we were before. And I think we have to be serious about how brutally competitive the world is. And I think the idea that we should just hope that if we just have fair competition, everything will work out is unrealistic. I think we do need government at the federal or provincial level making some big bets. How to do that in a way that's reasonably depoliticized, where those bets don't have all the obvious problems that go to making those bets, which is that then you keep betting on the loser after you had it, or it's in Quebec or wherever. I don't know how to fix that problem, but I think if Canada wants to compete globally, either the R&D side or in different industrial sectors, there has to be where you try and put a little poker chips on a lot of things, and then when one of them is working, there's some mechanism to really double down, and on the ones that aren't working, you kill them.
Yes, and I agree.
Easy to say, yeah.
Easy to say, and we still, as far as I can tell, we're nowhere close to where we're actually going to make those bets, and especially with something that's around diversifying the oil and gas industry. What I'd love to do with the time that we have left for us enjoying the sounds of our own voices, and then we'll turn it to the audience, is let's talk about, in an era with a breakdown of the rules-based international order, where, as I said earlier, I think energy is going to become very exciting, and not in a positive way. That we've got despots, we have oil tanker ghost ships, we have Russia flexing its muscles, we have the Trump administration threatening invasion of NATO allies. Like, a bunch of shit can go sideways, and that's going to have big impacts on oil and gas markets, as I read in an almost daily basis when I get my Eurasia group updates. How do the oil sands fare? And let's just kind of, set the table. If it's not going to be, and to your point, Sara, it's not going to be, let's say, a sharp where you're going to get to some peak at some point, and let's say it could be this decade, it could be first half of the 2030s, and then you're going to have this plateau, and then you're going to have this gradual decline. How does the oil sands fare? And I ask not as a disinterested party, I ask as an Albertan. And once again, I'll completely acknowledge that a good chunk of our public coffers are dependent on oil and gas, and the oil sands being the biggest chunk of that. And I'd love to hear, if you can, a case for the resilience of the oil sands under, new economic and geopolitical conditions, and a case against the resilience of the oil sands.
We should talk about who is for and who is against. I'll say something. I don't know whether it's for or against, but I think, to me, one of the biggest things that happens, as I mentioned before, when you combine this sort of new world of plateau or declining demand, and then it gets even more amplified by a more disordered and less kind of collaborative world, is the potential for volatility to just go to levels like we haven't seen before.
Volatility, price volatility.
Price volatility, yeah, exactly. And so, I'm thinking through this live. I didn't prepare thoughts on this, but I think that leads to various things for, a province that is very highly dependent on revenues from that sector, which are then very tied to the price. as much as, again, I feel like it's everybody's favorite thing to say, we need to get off the resource roller coaster, but it's a little bit like we're about to go from the, Mickey Mouse, like kiddie coaster to the loop-de-loop or something like that. And I think we need to think even more seriously about how, what kind of mechanisms we can use to absorb that volatility, right? Like really like financial mechanisms. And because, as I said, I think that you're going to see gets us through that time. And again, I go back to, I think fundamentally a lot of this stuff is about having good structures within government, and good, sort of strong approaches that lead to the right kind of outcomes, is relying less on one individual that's, sitting in a seat, and more on saying, how can we design the system to require, that kind of volatility smoothing. I think that's going to get even more critical in a way that we haven't seen before.
I mean, my expectation for Oilsands is they keep kind of grinding along producing, that I don't see a lot of stuff being shut down for a long time anyway, but that I just don't see expansion. And I see them more and more shifting to just operating to try and, minimize op cost and maximize extracted value. I think the question of whether we'll see more volatility is really interesting. I think it's really interesting to have Sara say this. I mean, who the heck knows? Predicting the future is so hard. I think overall I would kind of bet the other way, but you could certainly imagine. I mean, if Russia really politically implodes, that might temporarily drive oil prices high because they're such a big producer. I think you could imagine worlds where, let's say the electric vehicle stuff keeps happening even faster. I think Sara and I think it will be. There may be times where sort of the remnants of OPEC really try and drive prices low. So I think you could imagine really low prices. It's very, very hard to know. Overall, I kind of don't expect me more volatile, but I am not an oil market expert, so who knows?
Yeah, and although it might seem far-fetched right now, we are one Arab Spring away that would affect the House of Saud from oil price volatility being absolutely unprecedented. Russia, for sure, that regime falls, the Putin regime falls, and let's all hope for that personally. Yeah. It would be have a huge effect. The House of Saud would just fundamentally remake oil markets.
Yeah, I was on a panel many years ago with someone who made the point that the sort of resiliency and reliability of liquid fuels like oil, yes, there's some inherent ways that there is some reliability to it in the way that, it's easier to store than electrons and stuff like that. But there is also, a giant sort of military complex and world order that goes into also creating that reliability. So I think part of my And I think you're right, David, it could go either way, but I think there is a reasonable way of thinking of it that, if that world order gets more volatile, it's going to also hit the kind of systems that create this still relatively steady stream of, trade and balancing.
But I think the big point, maybe we're going to turn to the audience a second now, is that I think at least part of the Alberta politics that fundamentally is built around the idea that it's like the Fed's keeping us down. If it was a free market, we could really make much more from oil and gas. I mean, maybe some of you believe that, maybe it's true. But if you really believe it's not true, then we need to somehow find a way to shift the Alberta conversation so we start to have an adult conversation about what Alberta does next, which is not about getting the Feds off our back. It's about actually thinking about what this problem does in a world where the oil market's actually going down.
Could just offer my own opinion. It's a large resource, long-lived assets, stable rule of law. We are slowly but surely dropping the emissions intensity of the oil sands on a per barrel basis, and it's really integrated into U.S. Refining. So my bet is it's going to be pretty long-lived and pretty resilient. But enough from us.
Yeah.
So we are contractually obligated.
It was an MOU.
It was an MOU with personal liability riders to give Kevin Krausert the first question, and we are only too happy to do that. So he's going to model good behavior and get up to the mic stand
But I thought the deal was he doesn't actually have to model good behavior. He's not required to ask a real question. He can just attack.
I
Since
didn't
we
read the
brought
fine
the
print,
premium
David.
cheesies.
We all read the MOU in detail, and there was no room for negotiation. Honestly, thank you. That was actually a really insightful analysis, I think, on where we're at, and I think a lot of points of alignment. I'm going to maybe quickly open with where Ed started, that if the world was transitioning from French wine, would we or if the world was transitioning away from wine, would we expect the French to be global leaders in that transition? Which, if you actually remember, was you brought up as at a point right before we introduced Mark Carney as his first speech after he led GFANS in Calgary.
It's an oldie but a goldie.
Yeah. And what my response at the point was, I didn't think the world was transitioning off wine. I thought the world was transitioning to de-alcoholized wine. Whereas actually, I think right now, and what a terrible world that would be. Whereas I actually think right now the world is potentially transitioning from wine to cognac. And I want to make that point around the heavy oil demands and what like, to me, conversations on oil demand, there's just like, what is that? But let's subset what we're actually talking about, and that's heavy oil. And so there's 10 million barrels of heavy oil produced globally a day. Canada with the largest at 3.5 to 4 million. Next up, you have Russia. After that, you have Angola and Nigeria. And then after that, you have Venezuela. So as I'm saying, not all wine is cognac, not all oil is heavy oil. And what are the uses of that heavy oil? That demand is actually in things like asphalts and plastics and meshes and actually a ton of non-combustion uses. So you look at India, Reliance has just built in Mumbai a 1 million barrel a day heavy oil refinery. Where are they going to get that heavy oil right now? Hence the MOU, or I don't know if that was an MOU, but the trade deal between India and so the point is, not all wine is created the same, just as not all oil is created the same. Second point before I get to my question is, so you've all identified we're in this kind of frightening geopolitical world, and our competitors are some pretty unsavory groups on the heavy oil front. And our oil industry is the most productive economic sector of the Canadian economy by a country mile, measured by amount of labor per hour put in on economic output. We all recognize this is an area we've struggled in because our innovation is struggling. So we've got a pretty reasonable and good sector there. So if we're now at this point of saying we're screwed on our net zero targets, we've got a tool in our toolbox that the world might want more cognac and less wine that we can sell. And the world's not willing to pay another cent for the energy transition. Why wouldn't we actually use this moment to double down on emissions intensity? And that's, I think, where I would push all of your thinking to say, okay, maybe we don't have to spend this much money on it, but maybe we think about what an emissions intensity world actually does look like. And then that starts becoming a race we can win in a world where we're not talking about whether we're in a 90 million barrel or a day scenario by 2050 or a 140 million barrel day scenario. But I think we all agree we're not in a 30 million barrel day scenario. And if we take that logic and we apply it to natural gas, we win every day of the week without a dollar of subsidy. So why wouldn't we send our investment banker across the world to go and sell that mission? And it gives us a fighting chance on the next wave of technologies.
I have a couple of thoughts on that. I think it comes to me, a big part of it is like, is it who's spending that money, or whose money are we spending, and where is that economic benefit going, right? And I think that is a big piece of this that sometimes gets a little bit, I don't know if glossed over is not fair, but as David mentioned, and I think I agree, like there's certainly a world where you can continue to operate the oil sands as a cash cow. And what we see is many companies doing that, right? And providing dividends or doing share buybacks. And so the beneficiaries of that money is not necessarily as much the broad general public of Alberta as we can debate what it should be, but I guess my question that I would turn around and say is like, well, if there is all this money coming out and there is a world where that continues to be a cash cow because there is all this interest and market for it, then why should public money go into this business? If that's part of what should get done, why shouldn't the companies take some of that money that they would otherwise be sending to investors and invest that in building CCS and reducing emissions, which I think is a perfectly reasonable thing for them to do, right? So let me be clear, I'm not saying that I don't think that companies should do that. My question is, what's the need for, or the argument for, a lot of public money going into that versus the money that's coming out of the industry being used in that way?
Two thoughts. One, you'd mentioned asphalt, and this one's for Peter Poole. The environmental architect William McDonough, in designing buildings, said in his field, asphalt is thought of as two words assigning blame. Remember that one, Peter? Sorry, I had to throw that in. The other one is, and coming back to pathways, we kind of alluded to it. And pathways, it's been around for a donkey's age by this point, and it's like a big sort of blunt force instrument for reducing emissions intensity. And you would say that's good. However, we seem to be in this perpetual Mexican standoff, like this stalemate, and we remain in this stalemate in that you've got the companies who say, well, you really have to pay us to do this, or give us this unrealistic carbon price. We didn't talk about carbon price, but get up to $130 effective carbon price, and then we'd look at it and it's going to be cheaper to do that than it is just paying carbon penalties. Or we're going to stand here and not do anything. And this is why and as a booster for CCS back in the day, back in 2008, when we had David Keith come in and we did when I was at the Pembina Institute, and David came in and he was our keynote and we were excited. And yet we still haven't seen the progress, aside from a great project like Quest, which I think is a terrific project. And partly I think it's because for shareholders to ante up some portion of what they think companies should invest in order to drive down emissions intensity, then they have to think that the world is going to get serious about climate change. And I'm not convinced that the shareholders actually think the world is going to get serious about climate change. And I would say I'd look at that, and as a climate activist, I haven't worked on the issue as long as David, but I've worked on it for my own donkey's age. You'd look at it in the last 2 years, you would say, why would we ever make that bet? The world is not getting serious on it, so we'll never ante up our share. So therefore, we need government to pay for the whole thing, and government's not going to pay for the whole thing.
My donkey's older than your donkey.
Considerably. Your donkey is less known on the ski trail than my donkey.
I actually think the world is serious about climate change. I think one way to think about it is the world last year spent about $2 trillion on clean energy, and that's sort of roughly 2% of the global economy. And the big question is, if we'd invented an infinitely cheap, no environmental damage way to take CO2 out of the air, so the climate problem is completely off the table, there was no climate problem, what would that investment have been? And one answer is it would have been $2 trillion anyway, because clean energy was just paying for itself. I don't think so. I think there's a whole bunch of incentives and a whole bunch of reasons distributed from both national policies to local policies and individual policies that are driving it. And I think there's no easy way to tell, but my sense is, something of order half of it would go away in a world where there was no actual climate concern. So I think, in fact, the world is spending a lot of money and a lot of political attention on climate. It's not doing it in the way that some economists thought was some magic single carbon price. But in fact, I think there really is action. I think the action is driven by the fact that people can really see climate impacts in the real world. And I think, though, it's not clear that for people or countries or businesses beginning to really act on climate, that dealing with kind of residual emissions from I'll admit I don't know much about it, and I'll admit it's a little segmented out, heavy oil sector as opposed to the main oil sector, are really where you're going to focus. I think you're going to focus mostly on reducing carbon by decarbonizing through electrification and through decarbonizing heavy industry and through primary energy supply that's non-carbon. And so I think I wonder how much elasticity there is. Like it's segmented, but there is some way that refiners can change. I admit that that's not easy. I'm just skeptical there's a real big value add for kind of low carbon heavy oil. Just to concede a point that I agree with, I think gas is really different. I think there is obviously a global LNG glut coming up, but I think that gas is a really different story in decarbonization. And there some of the arguments that come from folks more on the political right here that we should actually take some credit for exporting LNG. I don't think those are nuts. I think that's a really different story.
So why don't we give Kevin, you're the host with the most,
I was-
give it like a 30-second rebuttal,
I
drop the mic, and then we'll turn to someone else.
Daniel, yeah, I was just going to say I'm bringing cognac next year, so we're upgrading. But I guess might be my thinking.
I'm loving this. We've gone from most upgrade. So you're now saying that some heavy oil is cognac. It's better than wine. It's more expensive. That's a really, I mean, that really is a kind of interesting claim.
It's the
And
heavy
I'm going to
ends
say,
that are
I'm
very
just
hard
going to
to
be a jerk
replicate.
here, but if you're right, then the differential against WTI would have the other sign.
Because we're turning heavy oil into gasoline, which is what it was never designed for in Houston, because we can't build pipelines. But what I will say is we've got a tool in our toolbox. The current climate strategy is not working. Why wouldn't we use one of the few tools we have in our toolbox to negotiate this crazy geopolitical world and come up with a new strategy and a new vision? And that's my point. I'm not saying how much. I'm just saying maybe a little bit of cognac next year.
Fair. And I would say the cognac to wine analogy, I use this with hydrogen. Taking clean electrons, converting them into hydrogen is like taking champagne, converting it into water, and then selling it for triple the price.
All right. I have one comment and two questions. The first comment is with the proverbial French discussion and the wine discussion. I think it's very easy to look at the past and judge the past from today. So when you go to business school, everybody looks at Kodak and say, they have the digital camera and they just put it in the archives. We laugh at Blockbuster like, hey, they could have bought Netflix not once, but twice, and they decided not to do it. So knowing 50 years down the road, who are going to be the business cases we're going to be studying in the energy sector, like, hey, they had the opportunity to buy enhanced geothermal startups, and they didn't do it, or natural hydrogen, or something else. So I think that conversation is more complicated. My first question is about what can the Western democratic societies do to be able to match China? I think it's a bit of a fair comment to say that they were lucky. We're comparing two very different beasts. China is a centralized economy state where they can do investments, and they don't have a return on investment. They have to come back to the investors, in the next year or 2 years. They can buy a mine in the Congo and sit over there for 30 or 40 years because they know that it's going to come in the future. That's not lucky. That's a complete different system. And on the other hand, when it comes to CCUS and oil, how the conversation changes if we moved into a world full of CBAMs with carbon border adjustment mechanisms. When you want to send oil to South Korea or Japan or India and China, and then emissions are not just a nice to have attribute, but it's actually something that is going to cost you money. So
I can maybe comment on the China one. I feel like I'm spoiling the China episode, but that's okay. It's a preview of the China episode. One of the things that I learned from the discussion that I had, again, with Jeremy Wallace, is that there is, of course, things that have come out of China that have been, largely state supported, but the success with EVs and the EV manufacturers there is much more of a sort of traditional startup story. You basically had companies that thought that sort of didn't have the baggage of an existing incumbent auto industry who, would rather an internal combustion engine than makes kind of startup level money selling an EV. and also who didn't quite have that same view of like, I look at it at an EV not like a sort of another version of this like super complex thing that, you know, only big companies are building, but it's kind of like a phone on wheels, and like maybe me and my buddies could get some money together and build that, and then there was some other guys who did it and some other guys, and you know, we're going to try to get the market share, so we're going to sell that for very, very low we can talk about whether it's luck or not luck or other things, but it just like, it was a different playing field that China was facing coming in. You know, they didn't have this sort of investments in the ICE engine and the internal combustion engine, where they had to kind of make less profit by selling the new thing. So in some ways, that's almost like the standard, like you talked about business school, that's like the standard creative destruction, you know, challenge story. So, you know, maybe it's helpful or not to talk about whether or not that's lucky, but I think it is useful in just thinking about energy transition overall, and whether it's about where government is investing or how we sort of plan things, to just remember how much that incumbent industry has a role to play or has an influence about the paths that we take, right? I mean, there's even these concepts of, now I'm going into professor mode, but like path dependency, right? And how we, you know, end up on a certain path that we continue down along. And we can say that that's a challenge, but I think the reason that it's useful to think about that is that it tells us something about where we can go and what kind of tools that we have that we can redeploy in other ways as well too.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how we're going to respond, we, Canada, other Western democracies, to China, but I think it's a real challenge. I think in some ways, so I think part of the reason that they've been so successful has been very effective adaptive regulation. If you look, we all know about batteries and EVs, but if you look a little bit ahead for driverless vehicles, they've got this system that's kind of got not just central state control, but a bunch of city and province level control. It's got a very adaptive system that's allowed, it's not unregulated. There have been serious regulations, but they're different regulations. They've been adapting fast, and they're learning very fast for autonomous vehicles, and they're likely going to win. And it looks like the same is true for drugs now. They're actually finding ways to get drugs through trials. They're real trials with real regulators, but they're doing it in a more responsive way. And I think, you know, a counter argument would be they're doing it obviously in something that's in many ways an autocracy that has less respect for human rights. But I think we need to learn from it. I think we need to learn to make some big choices at the government level, which they've done by sector, but that inside that sector, they allow vicious competition. And I think we need to figure out a way to do that, because the way in which China is just becoming the manufacturing hub for the world should worry the rest of us.
Maybe I'll add a couple things on China. We should really respond to his question about CBAMs. And if that's going to, but let me
okay.
Yeah, okay. Let me say a couple things on China first, in defense of Hong Li of the National Academy of Sciences, because I don't want Hong to wind up in some gulag equivalent in Yunnan province, and I don't falsely attribute that he said they were lucky. Hong, as we discovered, is on the watch list, which means that he has to toe the party line pretty quickly. If you listen to that interview, you'll hear him toe the party line. But I think what I inferred from that was they'd made this pretty big bet, and there was a bunch of macroeconomic and geopolitical things that could have knocked that bet sideways, including the Iraq War of 2003, which in the end didn't destabilize terrifically and for a prolonged period global energy markets, the financial crisis of 2008, 2009 that didn't bring down all markets for working capital, which it could have, and then also the fact that China inherited kind of the solar panel innovation baton, the learning curve baton from other jurisdictions, namely California, Germany, and Australia. And they picked it up and ran with it. And some of these jurisdictions really kind of ceded that innovation in that market to China. So in that way, I think they got lucky, and that is partly why they are, just the breadbasket of clean energy tech in the world today. Quickly on CBAMs.
Carbon border adjustment mechanisms, for those who don't know all the acronyms, I think the answer is if there really is an effective CBAM that means that there's some export penalty for this heavy oil, then that's where capitalism should work, and there'll be investment dollars to clean it up.
Yep. Okay, I know we got Joe on deck. Joe.
Can we talk raw politics? So elections, 2013, arguably the first climate election, I would think, with Wild Rose leader Daniel Smith saying that climate change was real a week before the election. Of course, the Lake fire following that, and then that was a big change. Fast forward a decade later, climate disappeared off the Alberta stage. Energy was there. I would argue it was an energy election. It was people voting for energy that elected our current government. And then just looking at the 2024 US election, very much an energy election. And then the last election here in Canada, very much neither on the agenda, right? It was all about affordability and sovereignty. So here's the question. You have to write policy for the alternative party. I'm not saying which that alternative party is to the current government for the next Alberta election. And is climate on the agenda? Is it not on the agenda? If it's on the agenda, how do you frame it for the electorate, knowing that climate's getting worse? And arguably, it's not the top 5 issue anymore, but arguably voters still care about this.
Wicked question. Wicked question. Sara, we've both been somewhat involved in weighing in on that for one of the parties here in Alberta. I don't want to.
Just to be clear, I'll talk to any party that wants to ask me questions. So.
As will I, but one party doesn't talk to us.
I like to sometimes say, I do policy, not politics. But I think you're right that it's really, in some sense, a politics question. Figuring out how to make up your tent around the issues and how to bring people kind of along in a positive story that you're telling. I just had a thought that totally went out of my mind that I was going to finish on. It was really good too. It was super insightful. It was going to have all the answers.
Corner Sara during when we wrap up, and feed her a beer, and that thought will arise. David, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is I wouldn't say that much about it. I'd make it clear the climate was a real issue. I'd have it built into some policies for housing and transportation, but not in a major way. And I'd really focus on understanding the stuff I've been talking about, understanding how Alberta moves forward in a world where the oil market is going to peak, where climate change is real, but it's how we respond to it more than what we do to somehow magically solve the climate.
Yeah, and Joe, at the risk of being a testy host, I'll challenge one of the premises of your question, and that is that the 2024 election in the U.S. was about energy. I don't think so. I think it was about a bunch of different things, and I think energy has been off the radar screen. I think in Alberta, though, if we have an election as scheduled in 2027, then you could talk about energy transition, maybe not leading with the climate foot. And maybe that's shades of nuance that people don't get. But I think you have to look at the economy and say, we've based on any given day 20 to 25% of our government revenue on a rapidly cycling commodity price or commodity prices. Is that a wise thing? And if it isn't, what do we do? And I think that's a rich conversation to have. And I really trust Albertans to have that conversation and to weigh in intelligently.
I remembered it, so now you're going to find out it wasn't as good as I said. But I think there's two messages that go very much along the lines of what you were saying, Ed. You know, one of them is really thinking about things like affordability, and I would argue that Alberta is a sort of special case where this like resource volatility and financial volatility is sort of a version of that for our province. But I think actually even broader and more fundamentally, it's like coming back to, you know, flipping that story on its head and saying, you know, we're the government and we're here and we can do good things, right? And that comes to like figuring out how to build government capacity to invest and create diversification. It comes into, you know, governments can like provide good services, and we can, you know, I think a lot of the solutions that also relate to climate are actually wrapped up in taking some of that back as, you know, obviously, we're not New York City. I'm not saying that that's the kind of messaging that's going to win an election here in Alberta. But I think there's some interesting lessons to, you know, put through an Alberta filter of the messages that resonated there.
You mean we're not going to get free buses?
I mean, I think it could work for an alternative party to kind of hammer this government on the kind of realism of their implicit idea that somehow the whole oil patch is just held back, and without these federal people on our backs, it would go fast. I think if you buy, and maybe I'm wrong, but if you buy the kind of arguments I'm making, that they're just fundamentals that say that's not the real world we're in, I think hammering Smith on the fact that she's not defending the real world, that just talking reality, I think would be helpful.
Okay, we're going to move into the rapid fire phase. Okay. And by rapid fire, we've got 3 questioners at the stand mic. That's right, you 3 gentlemen. And we're going to keep our answers like 30 seconds.
Specifically, I found out with some research that the extra oil we got through TMX was not primarily made into combustion fuels. It was made into petrochemical products in Chinese petrochemical facilities. In Saudi Arabia, they use gasoline, kind of heavier naphtha-based inputs for creating petrochemicals. And in Alberta, thanks to Peter Lougheed, as many people know, we use natural gas liquids. Are we, perhaps by sending extra bitumen to China, so basically we're taking ourselves out of the value upgrade process by putting more bitumen through TMX? What do you think about that?
30 seconds. David, go.
Might be true.
Good role modeling. Yeah.
I'll answer a slightly different question like a politician, but just say that I think we need to be thinking about the demand side for plastics and other downstream oil products. And this idea of, you know, to some extent, we're responding to demand. We do see a lot. I think there was a failure of an agreement recently around reducing the amount of plastics that were being generated. And I think that is a little bit the next battlefield around demand for oil going forward.
I think the Dow Net Zero project is a great project, and I think it's worthy of, you know, a deal with the Canada Growth Fund for industrial decarbonization, even a contract for difference. I don't see the bitumen going down the pipe through Trans Mountain, and whether it's looping around the corner and going to the US or going to China, I don't see that as fundamentally detracting from the viability. I don't think there's that much competition for supply.
James from Pitcher Creek, recovering astrophysicist. In a future defined by values-based realism, a new paradigm, does the value priority shift from abundance to resilience? And if so, in that context of resilience, how do fossil fuels compete with renewables? When you have the option to adopt renewables anywhere on the face of the planet, wind and solar plus batteries, right? How do fossil fuels compete in resilience focused, if that's the imperative, essentially?
I think it's very segmented. I think for parts of transportation, fossil fuels are going to be competing for a long time because of the enormous energy density of liquid fuels. I don't think that's going to get competed out for a long time. And I think it's also important to remember that while batteries are suddenly getting cheap enough, against my guess, to deal with diurnal variability from solar and really compete, it's a long way to compete with seasonal. And what that means is that the cost of electricity that's solar plus batteries in places close to the equator is fundamentally a lot cheaper than here or north.
I'll say a lot of people live close to the equator, and it does, a sort of breakdown or more challenges with this global trade and sort of global playing nice with each other, I think does tip the scales somewhat and makes it more expensive to get that resiliency from fossil fuels in a global world. But again, not kind of overnight black or white, but a change to the economic calculation.
Developing countries, I think in the short term, I laid my cards on the table. I think in aviation, freight, some parts of mobility, we're still going to be locked into oil and gas for some time in the next 20 years. And I think electrification will have a tough time competing.
I think it's more like 40 years. I think it's 40 years.
Yuri,
Thanks, Ed.
last question.
Okay, I'm going to try and thread together 3 concepts from the discussion tonight, and I appreciate what you guys are bringing forward here. It's great. So first concept, Kevin, thanks. Isn't it a good idea to be reducing the emission intensity of our fossil fuel industry? I think that's good. Sarah's comment, who's going to pay for it if it's not the government? And David's, how do we spread these poker chips around so we can quickly identify who the winners are and then focus those poker chips. So the question is what do you think of direct investment as a means to pay your carbon tax? So it's come up in tier in Alberta here, where you can pay, invest in greenhouse gas abatement directly within your own company, within your own operations, as an equivalent to paying carbon tax. And I'm not referring to the zombie credits. I think those are a horrible idea, but it is a way to pay for greenhouse gas abatement without government intervention or government support. And it spreads those poker chips around because each company that is paying carbon tax, a fraction of that carbon tax, they can invest it within their own operations. And that's a great way to lubricate the abatement process.
I'll keep my answer to 3 words: rife for gaming.
Yeah, I'd go with bad policy that's double counted and not needed, because if you invest in carbon emission reductions and you're subject to a carbon tax, then you get emission reductions and you get money by doing that. So it's sort of just a way to sort of magically invent more money that you're getting by doing that.
My co-host nailed it.
I get blunter when you force me to be short, Ed.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings, Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Emma Tandon, with help from Michael Edmonds. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy versus Climate is produced with the support of the North Family Foundation, the Conscon Foundation, the Trache Family Foundation, and you, our generous listeners. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. It really does help new listeners find the show. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our other EVC Live from the Energy Transition Center shows on offsets and carbon removal. You can find them back in seasons 4 and 5, respectively. We'll be back later this month with a show on China's energy transition, featuring interviews with a variety of China observers and experts. See you then.